Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside David Corbin. Glad to have you with us to explore the ideas behind today's headlines.
My left eye sees pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020 vision.
How you doing, Dave?
Great. How about yourself, Matt? How'd graduation go at King's?
Oh, it was great. The day was terrible. It was rainy and pretty cold, and there's a beautiful park right outside the church where we do graduation, and it was of no value to us because all the great pictures and opportunity for conversation out there you normally have, you had to do all that inside the church. But the ceremony itself went really, really well. I mean, I've had several people who've been at King's for 20 years say it was the best ceremony in their time. And I would say it's definitely up there in terms of my 12 years, maybe the best. So a lot of people had to put in a lot of long hours to make it happen. We had some COVID issues, just, the logistics of doing this for the first time in 3 years, the full ceremony and all the other events around it. So new people in new roles anyway. So it was a lot, but everyone stepped up, and the speaker was great. The valedictorian speech was great. All the things we graded a few weeks ago, they would have all come out as A's. So, and I managed to not butcher anybody's name, as I had to read the names of all the graduates as the interim provost, the thing I've been worried about for essentially from the day that I took the position.
Well done. Congratulations. So,
yeah.
another year in the books. So,
well, the funny thing is almost the minute graduation was over, we had this beautiful weather arrive here. So it's a gorgeous week. 70 degrees every day and sunny and bright. And so definitely felt like, okay, academic year's over and time to get out and do some things. A little more theoretical for me, given my ongoing responsibilities, but I know some of my colleagues at least are probably enjoying the fresh air and good weather.
Well, rest is a good thing. So, and hopefully we can get there soon here. We have 90-degree weather pretty much every day the next 2 weeks. So,
okay.
No complaints, however. There's still water sources here, so we're all good.
That's good. That's important. And how many more weeks until you have graduation?
We have 2 more weeks after this week. So these next 2 weeks we have senior theses. So we have, I think, 54 students who are presenting 20 minutes of material that they've memorized from a paper that they wrote over the year. It's the capstone exercise here at Geneva. And we had a big event, a benefit this past weekend that went well as well. So yeah, but coming to the end, and just a lot of things happening, left and right on campus, a lot of different celebrations, activities, and all the rest. Every day is like a field day here the next 3 weeks.
Okay. Yeah, we know about that from our homeschool connections, lots of end of year programs and choir things and all the rest. So May is always kind of a crazy month, but it's good celebration of things that have been achieved over the last year. So meanwhile, we've got only 2 more episodes after this week until we wrap up Aristotle. So today we're finishing up book 7, Dave.
Right. So 1 book left after today, book 8, which we'll cover, like you said, over 2 Wednesdays or 2 weeks. I want to kind of just give a transition to the last 2 chapters of book 7 in the politics of, and we go back to chapter 15 where Aristotle says something really important for us to frame everything that's going to come thereafter, that peace is the end of war and leisure of toil. So what any political community ought to be aiming for is a certain tranquility that comes from hard work, that comes from virtues that would not surprise us, courage, endurance, things that are required for the good life need to be there as a means. But at the end of the day, the object of human life, Aristotle argues, is happiness. So virtue ought to be practiced toward the end of happiness. And here he draws a clear distinction between that definition of virtue and habits drawn toward happiness and the virtue practiced by the Spartans. Spartans were a great warrior people who wanted to preserve their peace, but in order to preserve their peace, they had to act warlike in everything they did. So they never kind of let their foot off the pedal, so to speak. And that single virtue of being courageous warriors actually distorted the Spartan regime. And then I think this brings into play a lot of the way that Aristotle has outlined his coverage of politics. And certainly with anything political, there is the influence that nature exerts on the thing. So in order to have politics, you have to have human nature. But secondly, you have to have habits, right? Habits that are either good habits or bad habits. And those habits are either directed by rational principle or irrational principle. They're either directed by reason or they're directed by appetite. So a reasonable or rational approach to the right habits, the right ordering of virtue is necessary in order to achieve individual happiness and to achieve the happiness of a larger community. Which brings us to our reading for today, chapter 16 and 17, the end of book 7. And here it's very interesting that Aristotle takes an approach on questions that we still deal with in the year 2022, but he's, if anything, probably the furthest thing from libertarian in his approach to these subjects. The idea that someone's individual liberty ought to decide how a state goes about doing its business would be a foreign concept to Aristotle. And not to say that this was a foreign concept among the Greeks, and in particular the Athenians, because there's always this question, okay, is life to be lived for the benefit of individual human beings, or is life to be lived for the benefit of the community at large? Most of the, if not all of the early civilizations answered this question by emphasizing the importance of communities, right? That these communities were organic wholes. And at the end of the day, justice required what was doing good for the community, and the individual just needed to go along for the ride. Now, part of what makes Western civilization such an interesting civilization among all of the civilizations is that over time, the individual gains more prominence in this question. Is it the individual we care about or the society? Whereas you can still see in some other civilizations around the world that it's the organic whole rather than the individual part that matters most. Aristotle is going to give something to the individual, but he's still going to kind of play very much within, or think very much within, the framework of the community first mentality. So he'll talk about the question at the beginning of chapter 16, at what age should citizens marry and who are fit to marry? So he'll talk about how marriage ought to be arranged within a political community so as for its greatest benefit. And here he answers the question that you ought to have marriage for a male. I think he puts the number at around 37, and a female, he puts the number around 18, when both of them are in their prime procreative years. So the human beings, right, are brought into this world to help procreate other human beings and hence carry on the life of a political community. What do you make, Matt, as you kind of read through this kind of initial approach? Because it is very different than the way that we approach these questions today.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's, I think, the first thing that strikes you is that here in a book about the organization of the best city, he concludes that book, and really in some ways the sort of the pinnacle of the reasoning of that book centers on questions of marriage and childbirth. And for our purposes, other than questions about legality of abortion or the definition of marriage, the choice to have children, the choice to get marriage, those questions have been universally seen, at least in Western democratic societies, as matters of private judgment. Now, you don't have to go back that far to find a different model. And so, you think about Democracy in America, de Tocqueville, where he talks about how in an aristocracy, although you still have the legal right, you might say, to marry across class lines, the social pressure is very strong not to do that. And of course, that's a leading dynamic in Jane Austen novels, other 19th century English literature, as people either choose to follow those conventions or not to follow those conventions, and they bear the consequence. So that aristocratic context has at least something of the vestiges of what we're seeing here in Aristotle, whereas Aristotle, maybe it's legal requirements he has in mind. There's at least habits, customs, and social pressure that really you carry right up until the 19th century in a Western aristocratic community. And the idea that these choices are not really just about you and what you desire, but about the community and the health of the community is one that really has long standing within even the Western civilization, which you rightly point out has some distinction from other civilizations on this point. But I think one of the key lines of demarcation comes in with Christianity and with the account of individual dignity that we find really beginning in the Old Testament, but then brought into the broader Western conversation more in the New Testament era. When that conversation is centered around individual human dignity, then the status of the individual over against the community becomes a live question. And of course, there's been a lot of debate about whether the last 200 years have kind of gone beyond a proper Christian account of individualism to a radical individualism that prioritizes subjective individual choice over everything else. That's not in the Bible. But people who have corrupted perhaps ideas that had a biblical foundation have moved us in that direction, so that there's, in our own day, a real rethinking of the liberalism and individualism that have, for the last 2 centuries at least, marked the political trajectory of the West.
Exactly. So he's just going to carry on with this train of thought. And after talking about the proper age for marriage, he's going to say, okay, well, how much time ought there to be between generations? And he says, not too much time so that you chip away at the affection that one generation might have for another, but also that marriages ought not to be too early, that the children that are born of earlier marriages tend to have more health problems. So here it's, once again, it's kind of an interesting Aristotelian take on the subject, because he plays the part of an empiricist, taking a look at kind of, okay, what's the natural result of this from what he can see of births from young people. And this is going to lead into kind of the discussion that makes up the rest of this chapter and then the following chapter, which is really the question of, how ought the legislator look at bearing of children, the tending to children, the education of children. He'll say more about this, of course, in Book 8. And here he talks about certain more barbaric people that do certain things to their children to make them strong at a young age. So they'll throw them into cold rivers, or they'll clothe them lightly so as to expose them in a way that makes them strong. And here Aristotle says, well, you have to be careful and you have to be incremental in how you bring a human being into this world and not expect something, right, of that nature that they can't perform. But perhaps the most interesting part of what he suggests here is this is the current debate in the United States and will be so throughout this summer and beyond. What about this practice in antiquity of exposing children who are deformed, kind of putting them out in the middle of nowhere and allowing them to die on their own? To what degree ought abortion to be practiced? And here Aristotle lands on the following: let abortion be procured before sense and life have begun. what may or may not be lawfully done in these cases depends on the question of life and sensation. So here, Matt, work us through what Aristotle's suggesting on this front, and then we can come back to the, how the debate then would have been different than the debate today based upon this. It's not a question of an individual right to an abortion, but the degree to which the community benefits or doesn't benefit by certain childbearing practices.
The context is really two questions. What do you do about children who don't have the normal capacities? And then that's where the issue of exposure comes in. A barbaric custom that, one of the great testimonies to Christianity over the years was efforts that were made by early Christians to save children that had been exposed. And of course, really is the sort of precursor to widespread practice of adoption within Christian communities down to our present day. But then also the question of whether it says when couples have children in excess. And so that's, you think about a modern China or a place like that wants to control the number of children. That's where he says that abortion is appropriate before sense and life have begun. Now, this is very interesting because, if you read Roe versus Wade, Justice Blackmun dwells rather extensively on some of the historical data, not always interpreted correctly and sometimes very selectively chosen. But he goes back to ancient Greek practice and tries to make the case that abortion was generally allowed under a long scope of historical legal regimes. But if you look closely at what Aristotle's saying, this really ends up being, in our modern terms, a strong pro-life position. If we say, well, abortion has to be procured before sense and life have begun, then we would say, okay, well, life begins at conception. And we recognize that's a controversial claim today in the sense that it's controverted, but it's really not controversial in any meaningful sense. We can make very simple arguments that demonstrate that life begins at conception. Biologically, it is unquestionably the case that you have a unique member of the species Homo sapiens at that point, genetically. Distinct.
Yeah, right, exactly. And then this point, what I always mention is, if you go out to a store to get a pregnancy test, you're not trying to figure out whether or not you've got a cow in your womb, right? It's a human being, right? It's
right.
It's actually testing, right, for a human being, correct?
Exactly, right. So, and the point at which that pregnancy begins, that test would reveal whether you're a woman's pregnant or not, is at conception. There's no question about that. And then a second argument that's just obvious and very Aristotelian is a teleological argument. At what point does a process begin that in the normal course of events leads to a fully developed human being? And the answer is at conception, not before, not after. So there's really no debate about the question of when life begins. And on Aristotle's terms, then, with better science than he had available to him at the time, then I think you would say, applying that principle, you would say that abortion should not be allowed at any stage of pregnancy. What's interesting, I think, is that the real debate, which of course those on the pro-choice side don't want to have, is really over whether it's okay to kill people, because that's actually where you might say the religious premise comes in. I admit what Dostoevsky claims, that if there's no God, then all is permissible. So there's really no question that abortion takes a human life. The question is whether it's okay to take a human life. But not surprising, most pro-choice advocates don't want to defend the ground that, yes, it's okay to take a human life. And so they prefer to pretend that there's some ambiguity over when life begins, because that allows them to avoid that obvious moral imperative that we all know, that one does not take human life.
Yeah, and you mentioned this, and I think this is really kind of one of the kind of neat and incredible aspects of technology over the last 15 or 20 years, just the ability to see the human formed in the womb. I just remember from my first son, born 29 years ago, to what you see in pictures today at a clarity, it's just amazing. I mean, it's kind of undeniable, or it's deniable, but it's difficult to deny the human person in that womb. So yeah, he'll go on here and he'll talk, well, the state just doesn't stop having a right to legally set standards for coming into life and all the rest, but the state has an interest beyond birth. So the state ought to tend towards the education of young children. So he'll talk about, that from birth until the age of 5, few demands should be made upon the child in terms of study, lest its growth, he writes, be impeded. And he mentions these directors of education within a community that would not only tend towards the physical nurturing of children, but also their intellectual nurturing and what stories they hear, what they say. So the state very much has a stake in how its children are educated. And note there, its children are educated. So individual human beings are part of families, but there is something that the community holds over those individual families. So very, very, very interesting here when he goes through these things. Anything stand out to you in this question of how children ought to be reared and taken care of physically and intellectually?
Well, I think, given your current role, there's a lot here for the classical Christian movement, I think, because the underlying premise is you educate children in ways that are appropriate to their stage of development. Right. And so when you're very young, you've got to explore the world and you play, and you don't sit down and you take lessons, and then you get to another stage and there's certain kinds of lessons that are appropriate, but he talks about certain kinds of things that they shouldn't see at a young age, right? Certain kind of content that's inappropriate for somebody at a younger age is appropriate at an older age. And, the details of that might vary and be dependent upon his cultural circumstances. But the overall idea is one, very, very familiar to those in the classical Christian movement, that we recognize that children at different stages of development have different inclinations, different abilities, different things that they're ready to be exposed to and capable of processing, other things that they need to wait. And if you do this well, then you're educating the person at the right stage, and you produce at the end of all this somebody who's well educated and ready for the next stage of life, beyond that K through 12 education or beyond their post-secondary education. And so I think the overall orientation of Aristotle is one that is very helpful in framing the kinds of questions we should ask when we take up those big issues around what students should be taught and when.
And the key here, and this is where Aristotle's lesson, I think, is just amazing for us in the year 2022, is that those who direct education, quote, should take care that young are left as little as possible with demeaning presences. So in that time, Aristotle would talk about, a demeaning human influence, someone who was a servant or a slave who might teach the child, something, off-putting. But here, there's the ancient expectation, that someone, who was a slave, wasn't a citizen and hence might be a bad influence. But you could think of kind of contemporary equivalents of that. You think of the internet, you think of social media, you think of those demeaning enterprises that kind of shape not only the soul, but shape the physical habits of children. We at Geneva just are instituting a year prior to kindergarten called K-Prep, because so many of the kids who are 5 years old now haven't kind of developed those kind of hand-eye coordination skills that would allow them to hold a pencil or to do those things that you're doing as you're beginning the early stages of learning. If you're used to swiping, and for those in the audience, take a look at a 3-year-old and their ability to swipe through a screen with their finger. That is actually preventing them from using their fingers and their hands in a way that is most conducive to their later learning. So we're trying to, in many ways, help deprogram or teach kind of new tactile skills to students so they can actually hold pencils, have attention to a lesson, an idea, think through a concept, understand a word, understand pronunciation, those things that are so essential to early learning. So there's definitely quite here that is apt to the present day. So on to book 8 for the next 2 weeks as we finish up Aristotle's Politics.
Thanks very much, Dave. Okay, so we're going to close the show with the grade book. And so at the top of the show that spring had arrived in New York just in time as we finish up the academic year. And so today we're going to grade some good spring family day trip type of activities. So not quite summer vacation yet. Can't take a week off or 2 weeks or whatever and go somewhere exotic. But if you have a nice day and you got a little free time, maybe on a Saturday or, a little holiday, Memorial Day or something like that coming up, what can you do? So I'm going to give you 3 options here, Dave. Get your thoughts on these. All right. So historical site visit.
That's probably easier on the East Coast where things are 300, 350 years old. I mean, there are things here that are a couple hundred years old, but it's not as bad as California, where it seemed like the oldest thing was from 1950. So there were other than the missions. Yeah, exactly. There wasn't much there that was historical, but I think it's great. I think we've gone to the Alamo, and I'd give that a solid B. I think that those are really good things to do. I think they're great activities for children to think that there were things that happened in the past that helped produce the present. So yeah, a strong B there for historical site visit.
I agree that it's a great spot. It's nice. It's outside. It's fresh air. The only difficulty I find is you don't always get the buy-in on the historical piece. Running around on the open field, the battlefield, that's pretty fun. But then reading the signs or, kind of trying to engage the historical stuff, sometimes that can be a little bit of a battle. So I'm going to give that a B as well. All right. Second option, baseball season, of course, begins in April. So gives you a chance to take a trip to the ball game.
I would say that the younger they are, the harder the ball game is, because while you may want to stay 9 innings, they want to stay 9 outs. And
right.
They're like, is it done yet? So, I always found, right, that, that beginning of the game, when you're just looking out over the field, that first kind of half an hour when you sit down and you grab your hot dog, that's great. And even they're kind of excited about it. But then they get to, the actual, okay, so this is what I'm going to do. I want to sit down and watch. Now, maybe if they're like, you were very much into baseball and probably scoring the game and all the rest, you can kind of stay with it from beginning to end. But I would say that for most kids, it kind of starts as a B and moves towards a D rather quickly. So I'm going to give us a C+. Okay. I know that's a heretical, saying that to you as a baseball fan, but.
No, I get it for sure. Minor league games, there's so much entertainment between innings. I think sometimes the kids can get more engaged in those, also because it's just a smaller scale. At 6,000 people, 5,000 people, you're so close to the action. You kind of hear more of the sounds of the game and all that. So, yeah, I think that can be a good option to go to the minor leagues. We've done that in Harrisburg and other places over the years. We went to Fenway 3 years ago to take the kids to their first Red Sox game. And, you dream about that, you plan that, you can't wait. And then it's a wet day, cold day in April, and everyone's freezing. And we're, in one of those seats that doesn't face toward home plate. And if you did face toward home plate, there's a big post right there blocking it. And the people in front of us were always getting up in the middle of innings, getting food rather than watching the game. So
and you paid $380 for the 4 tickets.
And we paid a lot of money. Yeah, it was not exactly the way I pictured it. So they could you've got to take us back a better day, Dad. So I'm glad they want to go back. That's a victory. My son and father and I went to a game a couple of weeks ago, opening weekend with the Yankees and Red Sox. Had a great time. And, now that Caleb's old enough to score, it definitely kept us in the game and had a fun time. But yeah, I think it's one of those things that on paper probably grades a little higher than the actual experience, but I can't give it up. We gotta keep at it, keep going to ball games in the spring and summer as the summer unfolds. I'm going to give it a B, aspirationally. All right, lastly, I think it's more like maybe up your alley, the lake or the beach trip.
Well, that's an easy one. Here it is already, as I mentioned earlier in the show, in the 90s every day. So it's a requirement that you head toward water
Yeah.
for your sanity. And around here, which is kind of what surprised us when we first visited South Texas 5 years ago, there's just a lot of great water spots, mostly rivers. A day at the beach in Texas is a definite F. Going through muddy, brown, oily water on the Gulf is just not my idea of a good time. Maybe California spoiled me, but yes. But the rivers here, there's a great river runs through a city called New Braunfels called the Comal. That is the shortest river in Texas, and I think the most enjoyable river in Texas as well. Cuts right through the center of town. You get 2 hours out on the water, swimming in fresh water, and as long as you can get a parking spot, it's free. And my idea of a good day, inexpensive. Kids get outside, get in the water when it's hot. So that would be an A for me.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think spring up here, you're probably not getting in the water unless you're really brave or you've got several extra layers on. But to be around the water and maybe take a little walk around a lake or that kind of thing, we've got some nice spots nearby that we can go to. I'm going to give that one an A as well. All right, well, that's going to wrap up the show for this week. Thank you, as always, for listening. Please remember to subscribe and review the show on your favorite podcast platform. You can contact us at democracyinamericatoday@gmail.com. Look forward to talking to you next week.